Shabbat Shalom. Why am I having interference? Is it all right now? All right, now try that. Is it coming through okay? Douglas is always saying he can't hear me, so I've got to make sure that I don't need the heavenly affirmation there, however. How is it now? Okay? Still sounds a little reverberating. It's interesting, quite often, the Sabbath after Thanksgiving comes on Deuteronomy 5. And many of you may not know what Deuteronomy 5 is, but you also may because it's fairly famous. It's the reiteration of the Ten Commandments. Exodus 20 is the first place we see it, then Deuteronomy 5. And when you look at the schedule on the calendar, Deuteronomy 5 is our chapter in the Torah, and then in the Haftarah, the prophets, is Ezekiel 20, then Hebrews 12:29, and the Psalm today is 131. I'm going to read the passage from Ezekiel and then read part of Deuteronomy 5. We're facing something in these passages that's just part of human nature. In fact, you hear about it so much you can kind of get hardened to it. Inured is the fancy word. I think we all know if you've heard something often enough, very often the words, you don't process them. But Ezekiel 20 verse 8, speaking to Israel, "But they rebelled against me and were not willing to listen to me. They did not cast away the detestable things of their eyes, nor did they forsake the idols of Egypt. Then I resolved to pour out my wrath on them, to accomplish my anger against them in the midst of the land of Egypt. But I acted for the sake of my name, that it should not be profaned in the sight of the nations among whom they lived, in whose sight I made myself known to them by bringing them out of the land of Egypt. So I took them out of the land of Egypt and brought them into the wilderness. I gave them my statutes and informed them of my ordinances, by which, if a man observes them, he will live. Also I gave them my Sabbaths to be a sign between me and them, that they might know that I am the Lord who sanctifies them." This passage, and then in Deuteronomy, I'm going to go to verse 22. The first verses are, again, the Ten Commandments. If you don't know the Ten Commandments, you owe it to yourself to memorize them. It's not hard. And I always remind people that they did a survey, and this has been a few years ago. I don't think it would be a lot different now. Could be a little. But they asked people if they believed in the Ten Commandments. The vast majority said yes. Then they asked them to list them. Most people couldn't name 3. You can't believe in something you have no idea what it says. And so, know the Ten Commandments. It's not hard. There's a little difficulty between Jews and Christians on what the first commandment is. Typically, as Christians, we say the first commandment is, "You shall have no gods before me. You shall not make a graven image," is the second one. For the Jews, the first commandment is, "I am the Lord your God who led you out of slavery in the land of Egypt." That's an important commandment because of this reason. It identifies how we escaped bondage. In any case, I'll bet you most of you here know them. If you don't know them in order, that's probably all right, but you should know them. Moses repeats them, and then in verse 22 he says, these words, the 10 commandments, and actually I think most of you know in Hebrew it's not 10 commandments, it's 10 words. The Lord spoke to all your assembly at the mountain from the midst of the fire, of the cloud, and of the thick gloom with a great voice, and he added no more. He wrote them on 2 tablets of stone and gave them to me. And when you heard the voice from the midst of the darkness, while the mountain was burning with fire, you came near to me, all the heads of your tribes and your elders. You said, behold, The Lord our God has shown us his glory and his greatness. And we have heard his voice from the midst of the fire. We have seen today that God speaks with man, yet he lives. Now then, why should we die? In other words, we lived through this, but we're not quite sure how. And we're not willing to try it again. For this great fire will consume us. If we hear the voice of the Lord our God any longer, then we will die. For who is there of all flesh who has heard the voice of the living God speaking from the midst of the fire, as we have and lived? Go near and hear all that the Lord our God says, then speak to us all that the Lord our God speaks to you, and we will hear it and do it. Thousands or millions of sermons have been preached on Israel being afraid of the voice of God and wanting Moses to be their intermediary. In a certain sense, you have to be understanding of the position of Israel, because even God saw the need for us to have an intermediary. As you go down in this, the Lord heard the voice of your words when you spoke to me, and the Lord said to me, I have heard the voice of the words of this people, which they have spoken to you. They have done well in all that they have spoken. Oh, that they had such a heart in them that they would fear me and keep all my commandments always, that it may be well with them and with their sons forever. What do you think would help the Israelites fear the name of the Lord? If you've never done it, Kaya talked some years ago and mentioned this. Go to the Bible and study the fear of the Lord. There's almost nothing that has more blessing that comes to us than the fear of the Lord. If you go to Exodus 20, Moses tells the people that if you'll stay and hear the voice of the Lord, that the fear of the Lord will come and keep you from sinning. So in a certain sense, the reason we don't like hearing the voice of the Lord is what? We want to keep sinning. We wouldn't say it that way, but there's something in us that resists that voice. Go say to them, return to your tents, but as for you, stand here by me, that I may speak to you. This is God speaking to Moses. That I may speak to you all the commandments and the statutes and the judgments which you shall teach them, that they may observe them in the land which I give them to possess. So you shall observe to do, just as the Lord your God has commanded you. You shall not turn aside to the right or to the left. You shall walk in all the way which the Lord your God has commanded you, that you may live, and that it may be well with you, and that you may prolong your days in the land which you will possess. Did you know you could summarize the Bible, the message, with this? Do what it says. How come that doesn't work? Why is it so hard to do what we're asked? You ever wondered that? There's something in human nature that even the very act of being asked to do it, our reaction is, no, I won't. Carrie.
Well, we were having a struggle with Ella, and her answer was because I don't want to.
Carrie says that they were having a struggle with Ella, and her answer was, I don't want to. One of my favorite things I ever heard was from Aiden when he was probably about 3. And he said, I can't want to. And I thought, how like a young person to hit you right where, you know, isn't not only that I don't want to, I can't. And when you read this, God says, here's what I've told you to do. If you'll do this, you'll find life. And he says it'll go well and you'll live long. Why is it hard? Is there any way to appropriate a heart that wants to obey? And I was thinking about this quite a bit. And one of the things I thought, I don't know why I had not seen this before. The generation that heard the voice of the Lord at the mountain, how many of them went into the promised land? 2. Everybody knows the answer to that question. It wasn't a very good percentage, right? And so I've always, I don't know about you, it's like Bob Mumford one time. He was praying and pleading to the Lord, and he just finally said, you know, Lord, just once, wouldn't you just step out of the closet and talk to me? There's something in us that wants that intimacy, and yet the generation that heard God speak, it didn't bring life to them. It actually brought death, because in some way they couldn't accommodate or listen. And you know, Greg he's mentioned a couple times John Lennon and All You Need Is Love, which actually, if you listen to the words of the song, the words aren't bad. Most of them, anyway. It's interesting, the fellow that wrote it, John Lennon, he wrote another famous song, Imagine. How many of you know the song Imagine? What's the first line? Imagine there's no heaven, no hell beneath us. And if you listen to that song, what John Lennon says, if we didn't have all these rules, if we didn't have religion, we'd be happy. How has that worked? Has that worked for people? It hasn't worked. So if you think all you need is love means all you need is people let me do whatever I want, that hasn't worked that well either. Did I see your hand up over here, Greg? Oh, okay. Anyway, you know, I'm on this site called Quora, and you may not like to go there. I like to go there. It has all kinds of stuff I disagree with. But somebody will ask a question, and people will write in. Like, they'll say, what celebrity did you actually meet or know that turned out to be so different than you expected? And somebody wrote in there that had known John Lennon. They said, he's the worst person I've ever been around. He was just a complete, and they used a word I'm not speaking in church. And I thought, isn't that interesting? It probably has nothing to do with his dumb words. But on the other hand, I thought, it's very like us as human beings to say we believe something and not have a life that backs that up. And so I was thinking about that in terms of the time we're in. What sets us free from the prison? We're in a prison where we're not able to do the things we want to. If you read Romans 7, Paul says, I'm trapped. He says, I don't do what I want to. I do what I don't want to. He says, who can save me from this body of death? Now, but everybody here knows the answer to that question. He says, Yeshua, the Messiah, Christ Jesus. But then you run into this. How do I access what God did for me? Psalm 142 says, bring my soul out of prison so that I may what? Some translations say praise, some say give thanks. Bring my soul out of prison so that I may give thanks to your name. The righteous will surround me, for you will deal bountifully with me. We sang a song today. It was the first song we sang. I will enter his gates. What? With thanksgiving in my heart. I will enter his courts with praise. Greg talked about tradition. We have this tradition of having a Thanksgiving every year, and it's the fourth Thursday in November. And like everything else in this country now, it's become controversial because we have this old story of Squanto and the Pilgrims, and then we have these other genocide things all mixed in. It's getting hard to do anything without getting somebody mad nowadays. However, what we can completely agree upon is the tradition to be thankful is a good tradition. But how many of you know that the relationship between Israel being thankful and their inability to obey were completely, directly related? I want you to think about that for a minute. The inability to be thankful is going to directly relate to your ability to obey. You are an unthankful, grumbling, murmuring person is not going to be able to obey and hear the words that God spoke. Exodus 16. Then they set out from Elim, and all the congregation of the sons of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, or Zin. If you've ever been there, that's a desolate place. I took a picture. I wish I had it to show you right now. When we stood on the edge and looked at the wilderness of Sin, Zin, whatever you want to call it, and it makes our desert look like the Garden of Eden. It's just bare. So they came to this wilderness. It's between Elim and Sinai on the 15th day of the second month after their departure from the land of Egypt. So if it's the 15th day of the second month, within the last few months, they have seen God deliver them from Egypt. They've seen God spare their firstborn sons and cause Pharaoh to expel them from the land. They've gone through the Red Sea. It destroyed Pharaoh. It saved them. They have seen God move in miraculous ways. They saw the last, 6 plagues didn't even affect Israel and Goshen. They saw the hand of God in ways you can only wish. Actually, you've seen it too. Here's what they said. The whole congregation of the sons of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. The sons of Israel said to them, "Would that we had died by the Lord's hand in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the pots of meat, when we ate bread to the full, for you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." Is that fair? Why would they say that? If you can't see why they would say that, you have this horrible problem that you might do it yourself. It's so easy to focus on what I don't have, and especially, I love the thing in Passover, we're supposed to remember 3 big things: the lamb, the unleavened bread, and the bitter herbs. The bitter herbs remind us that life in Egypt wasn't that good. One of the things that we deal with as believers, as messianics, as Christians, whatever you like to call yourself, if people are constantly trying to change the name we call ourselves so we won't offend someone, get over it. Yeshua said, "You be an enemy of the world." But significantly, when you think about this situation and this resistance that we have to what God has told us, you have to remember that what God took you from was so bad, and what you've been delivered into is life. But if you're not grateful for that, you'll be unable to obey. In Exodus 32, now when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people assembled before Aaron and said to him, "Come, make us a god who will go before us, so that as for this Moses, the man who brought us up from the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." Where did this come from? It came from whining and complaining. The question is, how do I or anyone else help us not to whine and complain without whining and complaining about your whining and complaining? Have you ever noticed the flesh fights the flesh with flesh, and it never works? It doesn't do anything. We can get you feeling guilty about it. But I want to mention something to you, and this will kind of be the theme here today. The theme of Thanksgiving is making a place for God in your heart. Because where does he live? He sits enthroned where? On the praises of Israel. And when you praise or you thank him, you come into his house, and he comes into your house. The inability to be thankful keeps God outside of my house. And so when we whine and complain, we deny God a place. And when we deny God a place, we're unable to hear him, and we're unable to obey. Matthew Vander Els, who's a Messianic pastor in North Carolina, said something that really, I wrote it down. I thought it was so good. He said, "You cannot be grateful for something you feel entitled to." This includes your family, your house, your car, even your church. If you think it's owed to you, how can you be thankful for it? That really, I've been thinking about that because so much of the time, why do I whine and complain? Why do I whine and complain about food? Because it is my right to have the food I like, to have it when I want, how I want. And when I stop and say, oh Lord, thank you for the provision of food that helps me be strong, helps me serve you, gives me the strength to serve those I'm with, it changes my perspective. Here's something that really struck me. How many of you have taken something for granted until you lost it? You know, it's kind of funny. My whole life I've been pretty healthy, and I still am mostly. I have wondered at times if I could find on me somewhere an expiration date, if I'm getting close to it. But seriously, I've been pretty healthy. But I've noticed when things go wrong, I suddenly was so grateful for what I had before. I dislocated my elbow. Ben and I were trying to lift the heifer into the barn, and somehow I got my arm stuck in her flank, and she fell and just popped my elbow right out of the joint. And of course, I yanked my arm back, and in yanking my arm back, I popped it back in. I didn't know. But Ben says, Dad, you look like you're going to die. My face went white. I felt sick to my stomach. Anybody here, when you've had a severe, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But you know what I discovered right that minute? The things that my right arm did for me. I had no idea because I just use it and it always is there. I didn't wake up every day and say, thank you, Lord, for this elbow that works, this hand that clenches. I didn't do that because I had it. I was entitled to it. Do you know there are a lot of people that have never had limbs? Thankfulness is an act of opening up and realizing God is so good. And, you know, it's funny, that happened, I don't know, years and years ago. I can still tell it happened. Every once in a while, the tendon that slides over my olecranon, it hurts. But you know what? I can move. Most of the time, I can still do a few push-ups. It hurts a little. But you know what's good about the pain? It reminds me, I've got a right arm that works. I can still do stuff. I broke my ankle. It was the same thing. I never thought about walking, about running, jumping, any of those things. Suddenly I did. And something else I noticed, I'd never noticed a boot in my life. I was walking around with a boot, and I noticed a lot of people with boots. And you know what? I would walk up and talk to them. What happened? What happened to me is that in my pain, I realized I'm so blessed. God has done so much good for me. And a little pain sometimes, or a lot, allows us to connect with others that don't have everything that we just take for granted. Yeah, go ahead.
You mentioned the need for food, and we all have it, of course. But if you ever, I've noticed this about myself, that sit down to a meal and various dishes that you taste and eat during a meal, and I've noticed myself, there may be an odd spice in one of the dishes.
Guilty.
There might be something that's not quite done the way that I like it. And I found myself saying stuff like this, well, it was good, but, and I said, well, why did they do it this way, or why did they do it that way? And I'm so thankful for food. I'll express my thankfulness for food by telling you what's wrong with it. And that is so strange that if I'm thankful for it, why don't I initially just say, this was absolutely wonderful? Because that's not what we do.
That's a really great comment you make, Greg, because Greg mentioned that, and they're always getting after me because I don't rephrase the questions or the comments. But Greg mentions that we'll sit down and eat something, we like everything about it, but there's an odd spice, it's done differently, and if somebody will tell somebody, we'll describe what we ate by what didn't quite meet our expectations. And it gets back to this thing of the human nature that we need to deal with, because human nature without God is grasping and acquisitive. It takes to itself. When you think about Thanksgiving, have anybody heard this word, thanks-taking? You don't take thanks, do you? You give. Thanks is something that comes out of you. This is why, when you're full of the Holy Spirit, and Yeshua talks about a spring of living water, it bubbles out of you. It's giving. It's light. I'm going to read you Romans 1, because this is a real powerful statement by Paul. He says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth." It's a strong statement. Paul is saying that unrighteousness will suppress or put down the truth. "For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them." Do you ever stop to think about the fact that if you look at creation, if you look at the world, we can see God's attributes? They're evident in so many ways. And so Paul says they don't have an excuse. He said, "For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. So they are without excuse." And I've mentioned this a lot, and I think it's really important. If you sometimes, there's a writing that says this: if you can't understand my word, go to my works. Go to my creation. See, Mark is studying science, and Mark will know things about math and physics that literally, I don't even know if it's important, Mark, but it probably is. He's shaking his head. Actually, it's important for some things, isn't it? How many of you are glad when you get in an airplane that the people that made the airplane, that the engineers, the mechanics, all those people knew what they were doing? How many of you have ever wanted to fly in a plane that was made by a committee that voted on it? This is why Paul says, if you want to know God's invisible attributes, look at what he made. It works. There's a reason that the earth is the third planet from the sun. And we're going, all these things, we can see God's nature in it. But then Paul says this: "For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him." And that has really stuck with me this week, because I've been thinking about our inability to obey and this time of celebrating Thanksgiving, and realizing that if I have a thankful heart, I'll never fail to honor God. And I'll never fail to want to do his commandments. I might trip up, but because I'm so grateful for what he's done, that will give me the energy to be obedient. Stinginess, grumbling, murmuring, these things that are all about me, keep obedience far from me. "Although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things." The verse from the New Testament this week is Hebrews 12:28. "Therefore, since we receive a kingdom which cannot be shaken, let us show gratitude, by which we may offer to God an acceptable service with reverence and awe. For our God is a consuming fire." I don't think we understand, I know I don't, how important gratitude and thankfulness are. Because you can know what Yeshua did for you, and if you don't wake up every day and proclaim the value and inexpressible gift that God has given us, it won't do any good. It won't. There's a way that you claim the kingdom, and it's gratitude. It's thankfulness. It's how you come into his presence. And I've got a bunch of verses here, and I won't read them all, but How many of you know that it says a few times in the New Testament to be thankful? And let the peace of the Messiah rule in your hearts, to which indeed you were called in one body, and be thankful. Let the word of the Messiah dwell in you richly, teaching and admonishing one another in all wisdoms, singing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs with thankfulness in your hearts to God. And whatever you do in word or deed, you do everything in the name of our Lord Yeshua, giving thanks to God the Father through him. In one paragraph, Paul tells you to be thankful 4 times. In other words, this is important. Ephesians 5, let there be no filthiness, nor foolish talk, nor crude joking, which are out of place, but instead, let there be thanksgiving. Do not be drunk with wine, for that is debauchery. Be filled with the Spirit, addressing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody to the Lord with your heart, giving thanks always and for everything to God the Father. You go down to Philippians 4, he says, in everything by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be known to God. The one my mom, I can hear her quoting it now, 1 Thessalonians 5:16. Rejoice always, pray without ceasing, give thanks in all circumstances. So, how many of you know that talking about being thankful doesn't help much? What do you do? Here's one of the things that I noticed. When people have this first encounter with the Lord, whether it's being born again, the baptism of the Spirit, or both, generally they'll come out of that and they're bubbling over. They're full of gratitude for what God has done. But what we forget is our nature is the other way. It has to be trained. It has to be disciplined. How many of you know this is a scripture, that discipline will produce a harvest of righteousness? Are you disciplining yourself to be thankful? Are you making it a habit? You know, for a while I did this, and I quit because I'm lazy and who knows what else. Every day I would take out a notebook and I would write down several things I was thankful for. And I got tired of it because it seemed like I kept thanking the Lord for the same things. But you know what? It's still worth doing. Kaya.
I find it interesting looking at especially the Greek, but it's in the Hebrew too, that really grace is thanksgiving. And what I mean by that is
I agree.
charis is where we get the word grace. Like that's why they say give grace, or say grace, you know. But when Jesus says King, grace is truth. And that word charis literally can be translated.
Gift.
Yeah, gift, but to give thanks.
Yeah.
So charis is to give thanks. That's how they say it. So when you turn towards grace, you give thanks. When you acknowledge grace, that is what thanksgiving is. So I don't know how to describe what I'm saying, but there's something powerful about, like what you said, when you don't take things for granted, but when you acknowledge the truth of it, that's what releases. It's grace in you to obey. Because that's what thanksgiving is. It's like, I'm going to let grace work in my life.
I like that, and that's a good point. Probably most of you know that the word translated grace in the Greek is charis, or charisma. It has to do with gift, grace. And I think one of the things that I need to deal with is so often I want to fix what's on the outside. In other words, I'm not that worried about being a good person. I'd like to look like I was a good person. That's the thing you have to be careful of. Being thankful transforms me. It transforms us, as you said, and allows that grace. And one of the things you find out is that when you are giving grace, God's pouring it out on you. And this thankfulness. And I mentioned this, and I just want to reemphasize it. You don't take thanks. You don't appropriate it. You don't seize it. You don't grasp it. You give it. It comes out of you. Go ahead, Kaya.
I totally agree with that. There is a strange element to that. I mean, this is just my thing. I feel like the Lord showed me one time in a similar sense. When you give somebody a hug, you also receive a hug. Now, you get what I'm saying? So that it is something you choose. It's giving acknowledgement of God. That when you acknowledge what God has done, it's like that's when you receive what He
Well, and I think that's very true. Kaya mentions that when you give, you also receive. Otherwise, why would it say it is more blessed to what? To give than to receive. Because when you, and I'm going to give you a couple quotes here, that what they've discovered in people is that, this is no rocket science, this isn't revelational to you, you know this already, is what makes us happy is not what we think makes us happy. Have you ever noticed that we do the thing that is the worst thing we could do? It's like we're compelled to do it. One of the things that Yeshua talked about is light and darkness, and he talked about the good eye and the bad eye in Matthew 6. I mentioned this before, but it's very important for you to see this. He related the good eye to light and the bad eye to darkness. In Hebrew, a good eye is to be generous. And so in Yeshua, that's why he talks about it with, you'll either love God or mammon. And so when you look at a good eye to be generous, it's giving. And I think everybody knows, if you've ever gone into a pitch black room, the cave is a good example. If you're in Lehman Caves and they turn out all the light, and you turn on one little flashlight, the darkness is incapable of stopping the light from the flashlight. Any light cannot be destroyed by darkness. Darkness is always destroyed by light. But light gives. Have you noticed light doesn't take? In the universe, when we describe something that sucks everything in, what do we call it? What's the thing in the universe that anything that gets around it gets yanked in? The black hole. Anybody here ever been a black hole? Unfortunately, human beings, when we're into the stuff that's self-pity, you name it, we suck it in. Being thankful is an ability to give, to come out. And one of the interesting things, when you look at human nature fits a lot of the evolutionary pattern. You know, Darwin talked about the origin of the species, survival of the fittest, and so people have been taught that we got here because our forebears and us, we competed a little better. We were stronger, faster, more resilient, whatever it might be. But we find traits in people that don't fit the evolutionary pattern. And one of these is that people are made happier when they give. They think they'll be happier when they take. If I were to ask everybody in here, if I gave you $2 million, will you be happy? What's your response? That's kind of my response. Yeah, let me see how this works. How does it generally work to give people millions of dollars? Does it bring happiness? There are few people it works. But for most people, it doesn't seem to. Winston Churchill made a short statement that I really like. He says, "We make a living by what we get. We make a life by what we give."
I don't know if you heard the story about a man and his wife. They were elderly or middle-aged, going on now, but they won a jackpot, $250 million.
Oh, my.
And you know what they did, though? And it made news. It was surprising what they did. They gave most of it away. And it was, they had obviously more than enough to live their lives, do what they wanted to do, and help others. But that's what they did. They gave a lot of it away to build a school, to build resource centers for other people that were needful of that type of a thing. And it's amazing. And I read the story about what they did.
Greg mentions a couple that won the lottery, $250 million, and gave most of it away. You know what's interesting about that is that you can measure the fact that they're happier than the people that didn't. This fellow at Harvard Business School, he questioned 632 Americans about their level of income, what they spent their money on, and they were to rate their own happiness. I think you'll know the answer to this already. They found that regardless of income, the ones who spent money on others were decidedly happier than the ones who spent it on themselves. They did another experiment, and this was at the Chicago School of Business, where they had 96 participants who were given $5 a day for 5 days. And each one was randomly assigned to spend the money on themselves or on someone else. The only thing is that you had to spend it, if you were giving it to someone else, it had to be the same one every day. So if you were leaving a tip, an extra tip at the cafe or a contribution to something, it was the same every day. What they found is that when people repeatedly gave, they received as much happiness the 5th day that they gave as the first day. And the people that were giving their money away versus those who were spending it on themselves, the measurement of happiness is like double or more for the people that were giving. Why is that happening? That is happening because you have God in you. And that's how God is. See, when people say that, that there is an element in us that is very human, that's very fleshly, that's almost beastly. That's there. But the light, it says in John 1, that Jesus is the light that lights every man coming into the world. That light is in us. And I think, as I was thinking about this, generosity and gratitude are linked. They're very connected to each other. And I was reading a farming magazine because there are a lot of things right now that are talking about thankfulness. And there's this fellow named Dave Gordon who's been a farmer. He's now a life coach and a motivational speaker. And he said he transformed his life because how many of you know that being a farmer is one of the highest level stress jobs in the world? Farmers have more trouble with stress, nervous breakdown, mental breakdown. It's a difficult job. And he said what changed his life is he got up every day and walked around his farm for 5 minutes and listed what he was thankful for. He just started going around and looking at his fields, his cattle, and just started thanking for them. And he said, it transformed my life. He started it 15 years ago, and he made a statement that I love here. He says, gratitude is like a muscle. The more you exercise it, the stronger it becomes. Build your muscle by reading uplifting books, spending time with positive people, and thanking important people in your life. I think every one of us can stand to be reminded to thank the people in our lives. I watched my dad, and I've tried to emulate it, but I'm not nearly as good as he was. He would not eat a meal without getting up and thanking the cook. He would never go to a restaurant without thanking the waitress or the waiter. It was a pattern of life for him. And I watched that, and I thought, why does he do that? And I realized it's who he was, and he was allowing the Lord to come out of him. And what's amazing is that when you give this away, as Kaya said, you receive. I know sometimes I read Colossians 3, Ephesians 5, 1 Thessalonians, all these, and I think they're hyperbole. You know what that word is, hyperbole? Super exaggeration, I think. How can I be thankful all the time? Some days I want to be grumpy. And it's not nearly so much about being grumpy as it is about taking the time to be thankful, to say it, to speak it, to write it down. I suspect that we're all going to be different in how we do this. And I picked this up from if you go on the internet, you find all kinds of things about gratitude and thankfulness. But this Bethany Fulton, she's actually in Britain, the United Kingdom. she mentioned there are different things you can do to develop gratitude. And you'll find these in those scriptures we mentioned. But she says gratitude exercises such as journaling. Now, I think this works for a lot of people. I thought it would work for me, but I am horrible at the discipline of journaling. But this has been shown over and over. If you'll take a minute and thank the Lord and people for what they are doing for you every day, that it changes what you're seeing. In fact, when you look at 2 Corinthians 3, where Paul says, whenever anyone turns to the Lord, the veil is removed. Turning to the Lord is the act of thanksgiving. It's the act of saying, you know what, this isn't an accident. I'm not an accident. I was born to the parents I was born to. At the time I was born, where I was born, all this was planned. It's not accidental. God has a purpose for me. I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. Where can I go to escape his presence? Nowhere. This changes how we live. It changes how we think. So gratitude exercises, journaling, paying attention to the little things in life, like the birds and the trees. Telling someone you're grateful for them or for something they did, even if it was a long time ago. I've told you many times because it so impacted me. Years ago, somebody was up the park and they started to drive off and they forgot their little dog was out on the tongue of their trailer. And the little dog fell off and was dragged in the gravel for not very far because, of course, it was talking. It was yipping. And they brought me this dog and I'm like, it's not seriously hurt, but the hide on its legs, and it was all full of gravel. It was the biggest mess. I washed it all out and cleaned it up and gave the dog an antibiotic and, didn't think anything about it. I get a card for Christmas from people I didn't know who they were. And there's this darling dog on the front of the... I've never forgotten that. That's 25 years ago. They took the time to remember. And every time I think of it, I think, I can do this. You can do this. You can tell people what they did that made such a difference. And you know what? I can look around this room and every single one of you have done something like that for me. One of my favorite memories, there's nothing that will exceed this, was being tricked into a 60th birthday celebration. I am so stupid, I had no idea what people were doing. This is what you call someone who is out to lunch. That's me. And I walk in here and everybody says happy birthday. And then we have this program. I remember Kaya and John Paul singing Perhaps Love. Because I love that song. But I love Kaya and John Paul. And I remember Cindy, a whole bunch of people did things. They played songs. They did things they knew I liked because they took the time to figure out what a weird person I am. And Sharon, somebody put together this and I will never forget that. I will never forget it because people took the time to say, we've noticed you, we're grateful for you. We can do this for each other. And when we do, we look more like Yeshua. We look more like Jesus. We're approaching Hanukkah. In fact, tomorrow night, we start Hanukkah. And Hanukkah, if we condense it down quickly, is a time when the enemy came into Israel, destroyed the temple, desecrated it, put a pig in there, put a statue of Zeus. They made it so God couldn't dwell in his house. The Maccabees arose, they repelled the Seleucids, they reestablished the temple, they dedicated the altar, and they made a place where God could dwell in Israel again. That's what this is for us. One of the ways that we make a place for the Lord in our heart is to be thankful. Sometimes some of you are going through things it's hard to be thankful. My heart's been heavy this whole week because of that old shaggy dog. I've had a tough time with that. He comes up to me and shakes his face and covers me with saliva. I've struggled. It's been hard. But you know what? It'll take me a while. And some are even more shape than I am. But you know what? I can start being thankful that I knew the dog, that the dog was around. There's so many things because we're sad doesn't mean we can't be grateful. It doesn't mean we can't be thankful. And when we are thankful, we give God a place. And when we light these lights through these next 8 days, be thinking, Lord, allow me to give you a place in my life. And when you give him a place, you're always going to be giving your brothers and sisters a place. And a lovely thing about this is how similar it is to Christmas, or nativity, or whatever word we're allowed to call it this week. Because when you look at Christmas, how does it start? There was no place for the baby. And so God allows his son to be born in a manger, which sounds great to me because that's around animals and good things. But Hanukkah and Christmas are both about give him a place. Let him live in your heart, which means let the people that are irritating you live there too. I don't know about the rest of you. There's times I thought, God, the world would be great if you take all those people that just don't rub me the right way and put them off over there. But the real life comes in being thankful for the ones that don't necessarily make me happy all the time. This is a wonderful season. In God's mercy, he's given us his words. But what I'm discovering is if you want to access those words and be able to do what those words say, you need to first be thankful for the God who gave them. That he created you, he created me, and he has a wonderful plan. And we're all part of it. Let's stand. Brother Ron Eldridge, would you close for us, please?